My name is Annie Bunting. I teach at York University in Toronto. My doctoral research actually looked at early marriage in northern Nigeria, and there I was doing research in the 1990s. But my current work is looking at forced marriage in the context of war, and I'm a principal investigator on a project in 5 countries, in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Eastern Congo, northern Uganda, and Rwanda. Well, one of the findings is that in each of those 5 countries, there are practices that are described under this umbrella term of forced marriage, that women are abducted and held for a long period of time by rebels and militia, and that sort of practice of keeping women for a long period of time and using their labor, domestic labor, sexual labor, has been described as forced marriage. But in fact, maybe it's not surprising, but in fact we have found that what was going on in the war in northern Uganda is actually quite different, of course, than what happened in the genocide in Rwanda, and different again than what went on in Sierra Leone. And the other thing that I would say is surprising is that even though, of course, young men were also being abducted and were being instructed to take wives, or were being assigned women as their wives, we really have no research on what they thought of that, whether they experienced that as violence themselves, whether it was part of their indoctrination into the fighting forces. No one's actually asked that question of demilitarized young men in the post-conflict situations, whether that type of sexual violence they experienced themselves as a violation, because we just assume, based on, of course, stereotypical ideas, that men will rape willingly, or that that's just part of what happens in war. Well, I think that our project, looking at forced marriage in conflict situations, is seen as that much more extreme than, say, the debates around forced marriage in times of relative peace. So when we're comparing what happens in war to what happens in peace, it's even seen as being that much sort of farther away than so-called normal marriage. But what's interesting in times of war is that what the commanders in militias and in the rebel forces are trying to do is they're trying to tap into people's cultural understandings and social understandings of so-called normal marriage in order for them to buy into what they're supposed to be doing. So, of course, the obvious answer to your question is that what's happening in war is trying to mobilize ideas about what a normal marriage is. So what are the ideas around normal marriage? Of course, that means access to women's bodies, reproductive capacities. Women are supposed to be the ones who are collecting water. They're supposed to be the ones collecting food, pounding the yam, and making meals. But, of course, one of the other things that's surprising is that women weren't just doing that. They were also acting as spies. They were also, they had a variety of roles that we would not consider just domestic. I'm a lawyer by training, so I would say language matters. And one of the reasons that we got into this project in Liberia and Sierra Leone and in Uganda, Congo, and Rwanda is that what happened during the genocide in Rwanda was described as rape in the genocide. So what happened and the sexual violence that happened to women was described most often as rape, and then as legal cases proceeded through international justice mechanisms, it became important for those stories to be seen as crimes against humanity. So feminist activists and lawyers lobbied for there to be a category that could capture what happened to women during the Rwandan genocide. And what's really interesting is that there were cases of forced marriage during the genocide in Rwanda that, because everything was called rape, were never explored and were never prosecuted. So our partners in Rwanda now are looking at those cases and interviewing women now almost 20 years after the genocide to find out what their experiences were of forced marriage. And so language matters, because if we describe it all as rape as a tool of genocide, or rape as a byproduct of war, or something else, as sexual slavery, for example, we may in fact miss what happens to women and men, girls and boys, during war and even in times of relative peace. And then the Special Court for Sierra Leone came out with a decision saying what happened in the context of that war, a very prolonged war in Sierra Leone, was forced marriage, and that there should be this new crime against humanity. So, of course, language in law matters a lot, because if you're going to call it a crime against humanity, that means that the prosecutor actually has to prove that it was part of a systematic and widespread attack on a population. So language matters for law, and language also really matters for survivors.